Hello, this is David Lewis. Writing performance objectives is one of the most common activities of instructional designers. Many educators use objectives, and this presentation provides an overview for how to do it well. In this presentation, we learn how to develop performance objectives. This is a very important step in instructional design. And notice where we are in the Dick and Carey instructional design model. This step is a culmination of several steps that have preceded it. And by this point in the instructional design process, you have analyzed your learners and the learning context. You have also considered your goal statements by identifying sub-steps, subordinate skills, and entry behaviors. Here is where we take everything you've learned so far to write a series of performance objectives. And as we'll find, these are often based on the sub-skills of your overall goal. Since you're in graduate school, you've taken many classes to date and probably seen in your syllabi something called performance objectives. Performance objectives are short written statements that describe what learners will know or be able to do when the instruction is completed. Objectives are useful in various ways. They provide students with a preview of what is to come in the instruction and suggest what is important to pay attention to, either at the course or lesson level. In addition, they provide instructors or administrators with a way to structure courses and programs. That is, they can use this structure to ensure content is covered and not duplicated in several courses throughout a program. Finally, the most important use from an instructional designer's perspective is that they establish what instruction is to be covered and assessed. This structure organizes the instruction into units of instruction so that students will be able to perform as they should upon completing the lesson or course. Now then, in the back of your mind, you may be asking yourself, why are we developing performance-based objectives? Aren't there other kinds of learning besides performance? To answer your question, yes, there are many types of learning. You may remember we went over Gagne's domains of learning. However, Gagne was very clear that while learning may happen in the mind, as instructors and instructional designers, we need to verify that learning has indeed occurred by measuring learning during a performance. Dick and Carey also discussed this point repeatedly. Notice Gagne even uses the term intellectual skills to describe those types of learning that are most cognitive in nature. A learner performance makes us accountable by showing us that the learner has indeed learned something. Later, as we'll see, this will change how we write performance objectives, and in the next chapter, when we develop assessment, this type of objective will help us to ensure that learning has occurred. As you may be aware, goals and objectives are quite a bit different, even though they're both written statements. We discussed goal statements early in the Dick and Carey model. Goals are usually somewhat fuzzy or vague statements that need quite a bit of refining to become performance objectives. Goals are statements that give you some direction about the design of instruction, but are often vague and unclear, whereas objectives are written to be concise statements with a pre-specified format, which we'll discuss a little bit later. As you write objectives, be careful who you're writing about. Performance objectives are written to describe learner performance, not an instructor's performance. Sometimes objectives are referred to as instructional objectives, but be careful not to get confused. Objectives describe what the students are to do by the end of the lesson, not what instructors are able to do as a part of the lesson. Dick and Carey describe performance objectives by using an important set of criteria for writing objectives. They propose objectives should include three components: the behavior, the conditions under which the learner is to perform, and the criteria for judging a successful performance. This is a good way to do this, but there's an even easier way to remember how to write a performance objective. If you use a slightly different set of terminology, then you get audience, behavior, condition, and degree. This provides us with an acronym ABCD. Now, I'm not trying to insult your intelligence with this ABCs bit. It's just an acronym. ABCD means you write these statements with an audience in mind, something not considered in the Dick and Carey chapter, but also use a behavior, a condition, and a degree. And it's important to describe a performance, so use a behavioral verb. This may make more sense if we use an example. Let's color code our subcomponents and the example so we can look at these individually and easily map the parts of the objective. The audience will be red, behaviors blue, conditions green, and the degree just black. So here's an example. The learner will use Boolean operators while using a web search engine to narrow the number of relevant hits by 1/2. The learner and behaviors are pretty much understood here, but given this terminology, the condition describes under what conditions the learner must perform. This is exactly what Dick and Carey mentioned in the text as condition. And the degree describes the criteria of the performance, or to what extent the performance must occur. In this case, to narrow the number of relevant hits by 1/2. So let's look at another example. The cashier will be able to submit credit card purchases given an authorization system with 12 grocery orders and 12 different credit cards. Now, the Dick and Carey text used a slightly different order for some of these objectives. So let's use their order to understand how this all works with another example. Given appropriate demographic data, the learner will appraise the department's demographics in order to determine if they meet standards. This is an example that reorders things, and the order is unimportant. What's important is that the performance objective contains the subcomponents. As you write performance objectives, consider the type of learning that you're trying to encourage. You may remember we discussed Benjamin Bloom in another presentation. Bloom categorized learning into 3 learning domains: the cognitive, psychomotor, and affective domains. Bloom and his associates developed a taxonomy of objectives, and he and his associates wrote several books describing this taxonomy and how to use it to write performance objectives. Bloom is most often cited for his taxonomy of the cognitive domain. This taxonomy describes a series of subcategories of learning. Each of these categories, knowledge, comprehension, application, analysis, synthesis, and evaluation, are listed in increasing order of cognitive complexity until the highest level, evaluation. Bloom's work is often cited and used to promote the cognitive complexity of instruction. However, this should only be attempted given the learners are first given a solid foundation. While it would be nice to expect novices to act like experts, they can only do so with a firm understanding of the field. Bloom's writings are quite clear in that these categories build upon one another. Therefore, it is important to help learners build their skills from the simplest level upward, and not expect them to make an evaluation, for instance, unless they have already synthesized work on the topic. To do so, they should have already had a firm foundation in simpler levels. Bloom's taxonomy was initially developed to help learners analyze goals in order to derive educational objectives, and there are multiple domains of learning, but let's consider educational objectives from the cognitive domain. Again, as you pick a verb, consider the domain of learning, but also the category within that domain. Here is a list of verbs that were categorized within the cognitive domain. Now don't worry, a list of verbs for each of the domains accompanies this presentation. Please review these lists, and again, remember it's important to first categorize the type of learning, then provide your learner with a firm foundation in the subject matter, and then finally help them attain higher levels of complexity, but in that order. Now let's consider those verbs. There's a simple test for a behavioral verb called the Hey Mom test. What you do is you plug your performance into the phrase, Hey Mom, watch me, and see if that makes sense. So, Hey Mom, watch me ride a bike. Or, Hey Mom, watch me lay on the hammock. Laying on the hammock is a performance. You can watch someone lay there. Okay? Hey Mom, watch me play checkers. Certainly. Hey Mom, watch me write with a ballpoint pen. These are all fine, but let's take a look at this one. Hey Mom, watch me understand the concept mammal. This last one doesn't really make sense, does it? You can watch someone and maybe they might be understanding, but you wouldn't really know that they were understanding the concept mammal, would you? You can't, because it's really not an observable performance. So when you are deciding upon a verb, try the Hey Mom test. Understand is an example covert verb. That is, it describes an action which is not observable. This terminology comes to us from behaviorism. And while I'm not much of a behaviorist, I do know that the use of behavioral verbs is very important in developing instruction because it provides us with an observable performance which we can later assess. As we'll see, that becomes very important later in the instructional design process. Some designers start a list of performance objectives with a single audience. This makes the whole business of writing performance objectives easier. You can then follow that up with a single audience statement with a bulleted list like this one. This is just a shorthand method of listing out objectives, all for the same learner. In the literature, you may see this referred to as LWBAT, or the learner will be able to, and then the objective. Now, since Dick and Carey mentioned it, I'll go over this. There are really two types of goal analysis in the literature, and it's best that you know what is meant by goal analysis when you read this literature. The first type is based on the work of Gagne. We've seen hierarchical analysis in another presentation. And the second type is by Robert Mager, who developed a process that he called goal analysis. Mager was working independently of Gagne at about the same time that Gagne was developing learning hierarchies and hierarchical analysis. The Dick and Carey textbook actually describes both forms of goal analysis, but spent a lot more time describing hierarchical analysis. But in Chapter 1, Dick and Carey actually mention Mager's goal analysis process, which leads to performance objectives. Since we're discussing performance objectives, it's best to make you aware of Mager's form of objective derivation. I'll go over Mager's goal analysis process because it's useful from an objective standpoint. And actually Dick and Carey includes this in their textbook. But be aware that this process is sort of a quick and dirty goal analysis, which may lead to some problems when using the Dick and Carey model. I'll go through the steps first, and then we'll consider an example. Okay? So let's begin. Mager begins with the goal statement. We're supposed to write that goal down, and you can do all this on a piece of paper if you want, and you should probably use a pencil if you do so. The next step is to describe that goal, and typically people write down a series of statements, and these are just sentences. not objectives quite yet, but just statements. People write down everything they can think of without editing or judging those statements. And sometimes this is done in a group or individually. It's just a brainstorming procedure. And it's important that you list everything that exemplifies goal achievement in a series of statements. Next, we sort what we've written down and do some editing. Here's where you'll delete duplicate statements and get rid of some mistakes or delete abstractions, things that really don't make too much sense. Next, you rewrite those statements as performance objectives, and we've begun to discuss that. Finally, we will review our performance objectives to see if they're all relevant and, more importantly, decide if the list is comprehensive enough. So we ask ourselves, is there anything else that we have forgotten? Now finally, you look over your list of objectives to determine if all that was accomplished, all of these things that we've just listed, these statements or those objectives, is enough to achieve the goal. So let's use an example to explain this a little better. Here's a rather complicated goal. Nova Southeastern students will use Blackboard to take part in an online class. Okay, now remember that this is not meant to be an objective, this is a goal, so those verbal subcomponents that we discussed earlier are not necessary here as a part of this goal. It's just a goal statement, and not a well written one, but just a goal statement. Next, what you do is write down a series of statements. Now again, we're not writing out the objectives, just a series of statements to describe our goal. So here we have, learners will navigate the course environment and use the discussion board to interact with their peers, turn in assignments via Blackboard, understand the purpose of online courses, use My Grades area in Blackboard, describe peer assessment in Blackboard, interact with peers in a group assignment, and finally we've got use the blog tool. Now remember, we're just writing down everything, so don't judge it. I mean, as I understand, you're sort of wanting to write objectives, but right now we're just writing everything down that we can think of. We have a series of statements, and that is the conclusion of step 2. Now, in step 3, after we've got everything written down, we begin our editing process. So now you can delete those items that don't make sense given our goal statement. And not everyone will agree exactly on each of these statements, but here are some example statements that have been removed. For instance, understand the purpose of online courses. It's kind of hard to see someone understand the purpose of an online course. And also we've deleted here, describe peer assessment in Blackboard and interact with peers in a group assignment. Now, some people may want those. This is just a part of this particular list, and these were deleted. Next, we edit those statements using our ABCDs. We discussed this a bit earlier, and it's important to use an audience, a behavioral verb, a condition, and finally the degree to which our learner must perform. And we've done that here for a series of 5 objectives. Okay, on to step 5. In step 5, we test this set of objectives and ask the question, is the goal achieved? That is, we continue this process, sort of the circular process there, of asking the question, is the goal achieved? And if not, we write another objective and repeat the process until the goal has been met. Eventually, you'll answer the question with a yes, that the goal has been achieved. Now you see why it's sort of a quick and dirty. You can miss things. But the part of this step is that you actually consider everything that you've written, and you go over it and make sure that you haven't missed anything. You make sure that the list is a comprehensive list. and this will produce a whole series of performance objectives. Be careful not to write too many objectives to describe a single lesson. This is one issue that can arise with this method. Okay, as I mentioned earlier, Mager's goal analysis process is a quick and dirty brainstorming method of doing a goal analysis. However, this process of deriving performance objectives has several drawbacks. While it's quick, it's kind of an off the top of your head derivation process. That is, it is a brainstorming technique that can produce objectives quickly. It does not take into account the type of learning being considered, though, which can become an issue later in the Dick and Carey model. In addition, it's not systematic. It does not look at the individual subskills as they relate to one another. That is not based on subskills or entry skills at all. It just lists objectives, things that would exemplify goal achievement. Again, it's just a quick and dirty method of developing performance objectives. And sometimes, when you have no time at all, it's a quick and dirty means of getting to where you need to be, of developing instruction in a real hurry. However, given that you have a day or so to really look at it, you can take the time to do a full hierarchical goal analysis and get a comprehensive set of performance objectives. If you have time, use a hierarchical analysis to develop your objectives. This is the process that Dick and Carey encourages. And here I'll review a bit, sort of to give you some understanding of how you might be able to do that. That is, how to do a hierarchical analysis. And then, once you've done your hierarchical analysis, how to produce objectives from the hierarchical analysis. So let's look at this to get started here. First, as you may remember, you'll need to take those vague goals and rewrite them. And this is so they appear in your analysis as a well-defined goal statement. Next, as we've discussed in another presentation, goal statements are mapped out into a series of steps for accomplishing the goal. These can be procedural steps or steps in a process for attaining the goal. Finally, as you are aware, a step is then further subdivided into subordinate skills and entry-level skills. Now then, once you've completed your hierarchical analysis with subordinate and entry-level skills, then you can write a series of objectives based on these skills. You may even write what is known as a terminal objective. A terminal objective describes exactly what the student will be able to do when he or she completes a unit of instruction. But more importantly, you will need to write out a whole series of subordinate objectives based on your subskills and entry skills. That is, you take each of those blue boxes, the subskills, or entry skills even, and write an objective. It's that simple. This was the purpose of developing the hierarchical analysis and including each of those types of skills. Finally, when these objectives are completed, you'll have the main output of the goal analysis. We've broken it up a bit in these presentations, but that's so you'll understand it. Now we've completed instructional analysis, and we've used that analysis to develop performance objectives. Okay, well that concludes this presentation. But let's review for just a moment. As we've discussed, writing performance objectives is very important to the overall instructional design process. They provide direction for learners, administrators, and instructional designers. They provide measurable outcomes for the instruction, and as we'll see in another presentation, they'll help us when it comes to assessment. We looked at multiple processes for developing objectives, both Mager's process for deriving objectives and how to use a hierarchical analysis to develop objectives. This second version, the hierarchical analysis, is what is promoted as a part of the Dick and Carey model, for it is systematic and considers the type of learning and the relationship of individual actions to the overall goal of the instruction. The outcome of the hierarchical analysis was a series of objectives. Basically, you take each of those little sub-skill boxes in the analysis and write one objective for each box. Well, this was rather complicated, and you may want to review it again if you feel you've missed something. To do so, just click on the slide title in the menu to the right there. Okay, that concludes this presentation. Thank you very much for your time.